Right. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here in person. And thank you for taking the time to come out on a bit of a chilly evening to hear what we have to say tonight on recent archaeological discoveries in Israel. My name is Dan, as Paul introduced me. I am Christadelphian, so I like to think of myself as a Bible student. Certainly not an archaeologist, so please understand that that's the angle that I come at this from. So this is it's a sharing of a series of thoughts of recent discoveries that I've been able to find have occurred, and an exploration, I guess, of what they mean to us from the context of the scriptures. So just a couple of things to be aware of before we start. The first is that archaeological science is naturally something which evolves with time. It's not set in stone. The more you dig, the more you find. Even after perhaps an archaeological study on a certain site has closed down after 25 years, it still won't have discovered everything there is to know on that site. It's not static, and therefore the conclusions that it draws aren't static. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we look at these things. It relies on interpreting old stuff, and by its very nature, it's been buried for thousands of years. No one remembers what it is, and so it is an interpretation. And it's a snapshot, if you like, at a point in time, or more likely, it's a series of pinhole cameras, if that makes sense, where you get to see a little bit here and a little bit here of something which happened thousands of years ago, in the case of archaeology in Israel anyway. Now, these interpretations rely to an extent on dating techniques, and there's various ways of doing that. I won't go into the science of it, but it is possible to get different dates for the same item or different dates for two items found very close together, and it's worth being aware of that. And all of that leads to controversy and difference of opinion. As I said, I come from this from a certain angle. Every archaeologist on this planet comes at it from their own angle, and they have their own opinions. And particularly if you start looking into these things yourselves, you'll very quickly discover that there is a different way of interpreting things. So I've merely tried to interpret what information is available. I've tried to stick to the facts rather than the interpretations in order to give that idea of some of those recent discoveries. And like I say, if any of what we talk about tonight is interesting to you, then I would thoroughly recommend you doing some reading yourself, because we're focusing on more recent discoveries. I have taken that word recent a little loosely, but we'll get to that. Because it's recent, it's all things that you can find fairly easily from an internet search or the like. Remembering that as these things develop, the publication of the information follows along. An interesting quote at the bottom there, which summarizes some of the difficulties which I have had in putting this together, which is apparently fairly common in the archaeological community, is that if you ask two archaeologists working on the same subject a question, you'll probably get three opinions. So let's keep that in mind together as we work through this. So where I want to start tonight is with a archaeological site of Shiloh. Now, Shiloh was the site of the early tabernacle after the Israelites moved into the land, according to the scripture. It was the place where Joshua gathered the nation together to divide up the land, and it was the place where the tabernacle was set up. It's a positively identified site. There's no doubt about what it is, and part of that is because we get such a accurate description of it in the scripture, and you can see that passage there in Judges 21 verse 19. It's described as Shiloh being north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebonah. And today, Bethel and Lebonah are also both identified sites, and so it's essentially a site that you can set a GPS to and drive to today, based on the Bible's description of where it is. And because of that, the tell and you'll hear that word a bit tonight. It's a mound which contains the various layers of a city or a town or a place which has been built up over time, usually because the city exists and it gets ruined and something else gets built on those ruins and that gets ruined and it gets built up. So these sites tend to be mounds, small hills. So the tell was identified as early as 1838 by an American by the name of E. Robinson. And in the case of Shiloh, that was also identified by ancient writings, a couple of whom were Eusebius and Jerome. So it's positively identified, and there is no doubt about what it is. There's been excavations that have gone on at Tel Shiloh for pushing 100 years now, for just coming up 100 years. It was excavated in the 20s and 30s by a couple of Danish expeditions. I'll probably do that a fair bit tonight, please forgive me. There was apparently some fairly minor work undertaken in the 60s, and then there was some major work by an individual called Dr. Israel Finkelstein, who's a noted critic of Bible evidence, incidentally. Nat Geo describes him as the contrarian in residence at Tel Aviv University, and that's with his respect to the way that the Bible interacts with Israeli archaeology. He undertook some pretty serious excavations there in the 80s, and it appears to be undertaken on the basis that it was a biblical site. And that series of excavations discovered such things as the fact that this site had 8 layers of development, ranging from pre-Israelite through to Byzantine times. Some fairly major Canaanite walls there, so pre-Israelite again. Some Israelite buildings near the top of the site, which is near the supposed location of where the tabernacle would have been. And they appear to be public buildings, and with a bunch of storage silos in the vicinity as well. So it's associated with those buildings is the ability to store significant amounts of goods. And I guess in the context of the scripture, that matches up with the function of the tabernacle in terms of the people bringing their offerings to it. So it's certainly not something that would find surprising in that regard. Some of those silos included things like carbonized wheat, which a lot of the offerings included, and pottery, characteristic of Israeli settlement in that time. So for an archaeologist looking at a piece of pottery, they're not just seeing a piece of fired clay, they're seeing the style of it and other features of it, decorations on it, whether it's glazed or not glazed or fired or not fired and things like that, which tell them something about the time period that it belongs to. And so a lot of Israelite pottery was found at the site. And then there was also, interestingly, evidence of destruction sometime after Joshua's time. And again, with respect to the scriptures, that's interesting because it's evident that whilst there's not a specific reference, I don't think, to Shiloh being destroyed, it was destroyed at some point, because Jeremiah 7 verse 12 says, but go ye now unto my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, reference to the tabernacle being set there, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. And Jeremiah carries on in chapter 7 and refers to it several more times, to indicating that it was destroyed. So there is this clear evidence within the mounds or within the layers at Shiloh which indicate that that did happen and that there was a destruction after the time of Joshua. And so I referred earlier on to this attitude of doubt that we get among some archaeologists about the way that the archaeological record matches up with the scripture. And whilst that's true, there's also many examples, like the 3 towns that we have in my reference about how you can tell that this is Shiloh, Bethel, Labona, and Shiloh. There's 3 towns which can be used even today. They've been accurately located, and you can use them to locate Shiloh and prove that this is indeed Shiloh. So it indicates that where there might be doubt in other areas, there is no doubt in some. And it's food for thought as the evidence for the historical accuracy of the Bible as it mounts, if you like. So the current excavations at Shiloh, I believe there's actually been some ongoing there since about 2006, but the current series under man called Scott Stippling, Dr. Scott Stippling, started in 2016, so they're fairly recent. And there's been a series of discoveries within that. And they've included the continuation of the pre-Israelite wall and storerooms that were found. So they're not just an isolated feature, they carry on. And currently the team expects that those walls and storerooms will be found to circle the entire site. A new large building near the top of the site, and they haven't got to the point where they've been able to say what that is yet. But of note is that in and near this building, there's been Israelite era finds, which have included pomegranates or figurines of pomegranates, which were heavily associated with the tabernacle and the symbols within that. And also 3 horns of an altar. They haven't found the 4th horn as yet, but as I say, this excavation is ongoing, and they, as they always would, they do say they hope to find it. But the horns of an altar are referenced, for example, when Joab flees from Solomon, and he is described as going to the tent of God and grabbing hold of the altars, the horns of the altar. So they're a feature of Israelite altars, and we get them in the description of the tabernacle itself as well. And so there have been found essentially what appears to be a horn attached to a stone. Now, in theory, that is that is a natural stone. According to the way that the scripture describes it, they were natural stones that were found that appeared that way. There's been no iron tools on these, apparently. And they have independently verified that is what those stones are, with people external to the digging expedition. And of interest is the fact they've found these 3 horns. There are only 7 other similar, or i.e. biblical era altars that have been found in all of Israel. So they're not a common thing to find. They're very uncommon. And so it's quite an exciting find, and indicates that there are there's a lot of supporting evidence for the fact that the site did indeed hold Israelite religious services. There's been discovery of even more Israelite pottery. As well as that, there's been confirmation that this wasn't an ordinary city. So we're not, if you imagine a ruined town, we're not talking about a site that's covered in houses and streets. It's quite an empty site. It has a few scattered buildings in and around it, a wall around the base with some scattered buildings around that. But essentially it's a large open space. There's very little in the way of houses and streets. It's more like what an archaeologist would describe as a cultic site, a site used for cult-like activities, a site for religious gatherings. And also it appears to have been abandoned when Joshua or Israel arrived. There was a previous Canaanite development on the site, but it doesn't appear that it was taken by force at the time that you would expect to see from Joshua or from the Israelites arriving. So because of this large open space, that would have made it possible for the entire community of Israel to gather there for things like the division of the land and for the subsequent feasts. Passages like Joshua 18 verse 1, the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there, and the land was subdued before them. And also we have passages like Judges 21 verse 19, and part of that verse reads, "Behold, there is a feast of Yahweh in Shiloh yearly." So it was a place that had to gather a lot of people. And so it makes sense when it's discovered that it is a large open area with little in the way of houses and streets. It's a place that a lot of people can gather readily and easily. So that's just a collection of pictures of some of the finds. So left-hand side there, your left-hand side, is a pomegranate, a figurine of a pomegranate. And they found several of these on the site. Not a lot of them, but several. And they're sort of associated with the same area that the horn of the altar, which is that image on the bottom right. And the image on the top right is an idea of what we're talking about, what the archaeologists are talking about when they say they've found Israelite pottery. So it's not like it's entire pieces necessarily, but it's broken shards and bits and pieces which have to be put together to, or have to be studied individually to tell a story of what's happened at a site. So one of the focuses of the excavations at Shiloh at the moment is to try and understand whether there's a distinct change that can be seen between when it was occupied by Canaanites and when the Israelite occupation occurred. So, as I said earlier, the altar horns have been verified by outside experts, and that's quite important to the science behind archaeology, is having someone else look at it and draw the same conclusions as the finder, without the emotion attached to it by the people who've been digging there for years. In terms of the occupation of the site, as I said, it appears that it was the archaeological evidence is that it wasn't occupied at the time Joshua and Israel arrived, and there appears to have been an initial settlement, which we can perhaps see was when Joshua was on the site, followed by a later expansion when the tabernacle worship was centered in Shiloh, and scripturally that would be the times that we read about around Eli and Samuel and Hannah, and the stories in the early part of 1 Samuel. So it's possible that the tabernacle was placed in the remains of the Canaanite temple courtyard, and a man called Lane Rittmeyer, who's an archaeological architect, a couple of big A words there for you, suggests that that's possibly because of the fact that the tabernacle, by the time it arrived here, had been dragged through the desert for 40 years, and the linen curtains around the outside were possibly a little bit worse for wear, a little perished, and so having a stone courtyard to place it in could have fulfilled that function of dividing the courtyard off from the surrounding area. And it's possible that that's hinted at. Dr. Rittmeyer suggests in 1 Samuel 3 verse 15, and what that says is Samuel lay until morning, bearing in mind that this is when this is not referring to the temple in Jerusalem. This is referring to the time that the tabernacle was in Shiloh. So Samuel lay until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of Yahweh. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. So it specifically references doors. It's not, and it also talks about the house of Yahweh, which is different to previous references to things like the tent. So there's a suggestion there that perhaps things were a little more permanent by the time the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh. The animal bone deposits. So bear in mind that, again, the archaeologists are looking for things that can tell them about what happened at the site. And so often the food that was eaten there, the meat, etc., there tends to be a site where that stuff was taken, I guess, similar to our rubbish dumps. And so they're able to find those and sift through them and find things out about what happened there by what types of bones they might find, for example. So, and we'll come back to that on a different site later on. But the animal bone deposit there is overwhelmingly made up of sacrificial animals. So the scripture is quite specific about what animals are to be sacrificed, and those animals' bones all occur in this site, or in this deposit at Shiloh. And interestingly, the bones are apparently not so much overwhelmingly, but they're primarily from the right side of the animals. And in Leviticus 7, that tells us that the right side was the priest's portion. So that's interesting in the fact that if we expect this to be a site where there were a lot of priests, that there's a lot of bones from the right-hand side. The Leviticus 7 verse 32, for example, the right shoulder shall you give unto the priest for an heave offering of the sacrifices of your peace offering. He among the sons of Aaron that offereth the blood of the peace offering and the fat shall have the right shoulder for his part. So you get that reference there that the right-hand side of the animal was the priest's portion. There appears to be a series of storage rooms on the site that may eventually be proved to circle the hill. I don't know that at the moment, they haven't excavated enough, but the expectation is that perhaps that's what will be shown. Now, storage rooms inside a wall in the arrangement that are there are apparently not found anywhere else in Israel. And as I said earlier, they'd match biblical requirements for a place to store offerings brought by an entire nation to one place. A couple of other elements of note about Shiloh. Obviously, the tabernacle won't be found because it was hides, etc., and they'll have just completely rotted away. The altar horn stones aren't hewn, so they're not shaped, and that's consistent with Scripture. There's a large building at the top, and the orientation of that building is east-west, which is what we would expect from the description of the tabernacle in Scripture. Not suggesting that that building is the tabernacle, I don't think, but just that it's associated with it, and it is an Israelite building. And there are also similarities in the cultic platform at Shiloh, so that when we get to the area where the religious organisation, the religious services occurred, there's similarities in that between that place and the one being excavated in Kiryat Yearim near Jerusalem. And the reason that that's interesting is that there's Kiryat Yearim is another site that the ark, which was a key part of the tabernacle, was stored for a period of time. And interestingly, that site is being excavated by the chief contrarian, Israel Finkelstein, as well. So that's Shiloh. And for a site which has been positively identified, the indications are that at this point, from the various excavations that have taken place there, that there is a building evidence that Israelite sacrificial and religious type services did occur there. And that's very exciting to see in the context of what we would expect to see based on the Scripture. So the second item that I'd like to talk about, or a group of finds, are a bullae or a bulla. Now, what on earth is a bulla? And that's a very good question. Essentially, in the context of what I'm going to talk about here, it's the imprint of a signet or something like that. So in ancient times, in order to identify something or provide a authorization to something, whether it was actually on a ring or whether it was just a piece of stone, like the right-hand side, that was carried, you could get a soft piece of clay or lead or wax, and you could push it into it, and it would leave the imprint behind, as you can see on the left-hand side there. In more general terms, a bulla can be any number of things, from almost like a clay envelope with an imprint on the outside that showed that this was an envelope that came from X person, or more like a ring, where you could roll up a document and put it inside it, and it still had the imprints around it to say who this document came from. But I'm just there are certain type, or there are several types of these things. The ones that we're going to look at are the type that you can see up there, where the imprint of a ring or something like that, and they're fixed to documents or to bags of goods or things like that, to say this is a document that's come from the king. Here's an order from the king, or here's a bag of goods that's come from someone down the street. So there's a lot of them around, and they can be very uneventful things to find, or they can be incredibly exciting things to find. They're often not very big. So that one on the left-hand side there, and we'll get to whose that is in a minute, is approximately 10 millimeters across. So it's very small, and they're very easy to miss, and often they get picked up later on in the process, once all the dirt's been pulled out and the archaeologists go back through and sift it through, they often get found a little later on. They often bore the name and the title of the person doing the sealing. And they're often the only thing that's left behind because the document or whatever it was is attached to in the thousands of intervening years have rotted away. So there's been a series of discoveries of these, of important ones of these recently. And this is where I'm going to take the term recent a little more loosely, but taken together these serve to make a point. So there's a bulla in Jerusalem entitled Nathan Melech, the servant of the king. And in 2 Kings 23 verse 11, we find that Nathan Melech is someone who's mentioned as the steward or the chamberlain of King Josiah. So 2 Kings 23 verse 11, and he took away the horses that the kings of Judah had given to the son at the entering in of the house of Yahweh, or of the Lord, sorry, by the chamber of Nathan Melech, the chamberlain, which was in the suburbs, and burned the chariots of the sun with fire. So this is talking about the reforms that Josiah the king undertook at the start of his reign. He took Israel from being, or Judah from being having turned away from God and being idolatrous, and he tried to pull them back to the right way. So he destroyed a whole bunch of things. The important thing about that passage is that it identifies this man Nathan Melech with the title that he's given on this tiny piece of clay that's been found. And so we see a link between what we read in the scripture and what actually turns up from thousands of years ago in the dust of the land of Israel. The next one up there is Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, the king of Judah. And that's, again, it's a king of Judah, which is mentioned in the scriptures. And again, there's a tiny piece of clay which bears the imprint of this man from thousands of years ago. And 2 Kings 16 verse 20, Ahaz slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his stead. So again, we can see really clearly that's what it is. A couple of others found near each other in Jerusalem. Jehucal, son of Shelemiah, son of Shovi, is what this little imprint of clay says. And there's another one, Gedaliah, the son of Pashur, in Jeremiah 38. Now, Shephatiah, the son of Matan, Gedaliah, the son of Pashur, which is that second one up there. Jukal, the son of Shelemiah, which is that first one, and Pashur, the son of Malchiah, heard the words which Jeremiah had spoken to all the people. So again, there's just this solid link between this tiny piece of clay that's randomly been picked up in Jerusalem, in the case of these two, mentioned together in Jeremiah and found within meters of each other in Jerusalem. And that was those two were found between 2005 and 2008. So that might be taking recent a little more loosely, but nonetheless they're there. So the first one that was found was Jehucal, the son of Shelemiah, and then years later, only a few meters away, a second seal belonging to Gedaliah, the son of Pashur. So both of them high-ranking officials in the rulership in Jerusalem, and both of them discovered very close to each other. So those four are all basically complete, very little doubt about them. More recently, there's been one that appears to be a seal which says Isaiah prophet. Now, the reason that I've put brackets around the ET is because the word prophet is actually not complete on this. And so it's exciting. It's very clear that it belongs to someone called Isaiah. The prophet part is not so clear, and it's unfortunately broken. There's no certainty. There's a lot of doubt over it. It was found near Hezekiah's bulla, and the letters that are written on it are characteristic of the first temple period, which is when you'd expect it to be for Isaiah. So that's before the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians. It's the reason there's some doubt over it is it's only a partial object. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. Some of the writing's missing, and that includes a critical part of the word prophet. and unfortunately that's the bit upon which the whole identification of this thing hinges. And there's also another argument that says, because it would have been attached to a bag of goods or something, it might seem unusual that the word prophet is actually put on there as a title, sort of like a tagline. That's an argument against it. So the finder of it, a lady called Elat Mazar, definitely leaves room for the possibility that it's not Isaiah the prophet, but it is an exciting find nonetheless. So that's the image of it there. Your left-hand side is the actual object, and the image on the right-hand side is a bit of a sketch against it, showing perhaps how big you'd expect it to be. That's the blue circle, and also showing what the missing text would need to be. And as you can see, the line at the top, there's no real doubt that says Isaiah. The line at the bottom could just be a name without the rest of the word prophet. There is no reference to someone in the Bible called this. There are apparently references to a couple of private collections which were found. The way it's described makes it sound like they were found in slightly dodgy ways, but nonetheless they're in private collections, and so there is reference to people called this. But if you add a single letter, an aleph on the end of it, it turns it into the word prophet. And the other interesting part about this is that the broken part at the top appears to be a grazing doe, which is a motif or a symbol, if you like, of blessing and protection that was used fairly frequently in Judah and particularly in Jerusalem. So there's a couple of elements there that indicate that it could be, but it's very much a could be, despite the excitement that would cause if it was indeed the seal of the prophet Isaiah. This is Hezekiah the King's. So that's a fairly complete bulla. And the image on the right-hand side is drawing by an archaeologist from the 1800s, I believe, an individual called Warren, who did a lot of digging around Jerusalem. And this was found near fortifications in Jerusalem, which were known to be built by Hezekiah. So this particular item was found slightly to the right of where that image is shown. So it's the place where it was found is close to a large tower that was apparently added to the existing city fortifications by Hezekiah. So you start to see how perhaps orders coming from the king to the fortifications that he's building could result in one of his seals being flicked over the wall or something like that. And by way of example of what these impressions can tell us and why they might be important, what they can tell us about a person and a time period. This seal on your left up there that you can see, it has the writing on it is an inscription that essentially, that reads, belonging to Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And on that, you have a series of symbols as well. There's a two-winged sun with wings turned down, flanked by two symbols which symbolize life. Now, there's a lot of building works within Jerusalem that have been linked to Hezekiah. And so there's been other symbols of his kingship that have been found. And what we can be told about these things is that they suggest that this is a seal from later in his life, because the symbols have changed from an earlier winged scarab, which is a type of beetle, and when that was a symbol which was used by kings throughout the ancient Middle East, and it was changed by this point to this winged sun, which is a symbol that proclaims God's protection. So it's not just a symbol of Hezekiah. There's other aspects to it which can be used to describe a little about the time in which it was found and a little about the person who bore it. And so when that's combined with other clues within these excavations, you can start to see how a picture of what went on can start to be built. But nonetheless, it's exciting to be able to see that essentially the ancient signature of 4 individuals who we can directly read about in the scripture have been dug up and pulled out of the dirt. This next section is probably more for interest than anything specific that it tells us, but there's another excavation site in the southwest of Israel called Tel Es Safi, which has been identified as Gath, which was the birthplace of Goliath. It hasn't definitively been identified as Gath, but the evidence points that way. It's a very large site. And up until recently, what has changed up until recently, the site was thought to be a couple of centuries later than the time of David and Solomon. And there's a destruction layer within that city that's been found. So digging down, you find evidence of burning and broken walls and broken buildings, which have been dated to approximately 830 BC. And within that layer, there's evidence that that city was destroyed by a group of people from Syria. And quite apart from anything that this tells us about the Gath of Goliath, that links up with a scriptural reference in 2 Kings 17 verse 12. I'll start that again. 2 Kings 12 verse 17, which reads, "Then Hazael, the king of Syria, went up and fought against Gath and took it. And Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem." So we have this destruction layer in a place which is most likely Gath, which relates to a passage in scripture which tells us which that city was destroyed at about that time. Worth noting that the Philistines apparently didn't write very much, perhaps too busy out marauding and plundering. But what we don't have is a great deal of their own writings about themselves. So we don't know what they thought about their description as giants and things like that. But the new excavation or the new discovery at this site, so the old site was all thought to be about 830 BC. The team over the last couple of years on the site have dug down into another layer and found another city underneath, which the other one was built over top of, which dates to the 11th century BC, which is approximately the time of David. And all of a sudden this becomes quite interesting in the context of David and Goliath, or of the stories at the time of David and his dealings with the Philistines. And the interesting thing about this lower city, this earlier city, is that it is all just so much bigger than what's above it. What's above it had walls which were 2 meters wide. What's below it has walls which are 4 meters wide, and the architecture of the buildings within the city matches. Everything's just much bigger. The stones used to build this bigger city were bigger. In the later city, they were 500 millimeters long, approximately half a meter. In the newer city, they are 1 to 2 meters. And all of a sudden you start seeing how perhaps you can look at that and go, it takes a lot of strength to move big stones around. And that's not a conclusion that any of the archaeologists are making, but it's interesting in the context of what we know from the scriptures. It was a very large city. It was approximately as big as Jerusalem at its height. And its size and strength indicates that Gath was probably the regional power in that area, rather than another city called Ashkelon that had previously been assumed. So in the context of giants, archaeologists say that Philistines' remains that they've found in general, not specifically at the city, but in general, are normal sized. But of course, we are obviously free to look at these things from a scriptural perspective. And the exciting thing in that regard is that the city that existed at David's time had very large architecture, and so it proves nothing, but it is food for thought in the context of what we can see in the scripture. Tin in ancient Israel. Tin obviously is a metal, and previously there's several samples of tin that have been discovered in sunken ships off the Israeli coast, and from other sites around the Eastern Mediterranean, from Crete, a place called Moklos, and from Turkey. I won't try and Iluberin. Almost guarantee that that's not how you pronounce that word. And so there's these various sources of tin, or these various samples of tin that have been found in ingots, which is it's a picture of it there. Think of it as like a gold bar, but tin instead of gold. And it's the way the tin's removed from the ground. The ore is smelted and formed into these blocks to be exported to where it needs to go. There is no naturally occurring tin in Israel. And the definitive source of where the Israelis got it from, or the Israelites got it from at the time, the ancient Israelites, has been a mystery. So essentially the researchers found tin samples from these various dive sites that they'd found in those three places. So three locations off Haifa, one in Turkey and one in Crete. I'll show you a map of some of those sites in a second. And then they did a bunch of fancy chemical analysis to this tin, an isotope analysis. At risk of overcomplicating things, essentially you can have up to 10 different types of tin that are all tin, but chemically you can tell the difference between them. And similar to the way, essentially it's got to do with the nucleus of the atom, but suffice to say that you can tell the difference between these various isotopes of tin, and they combine that with chemical analysis of the rest of the sample to be able to assess the age of the tin deposit that this tin came from. So essentially what it does is it tells them, here's a specific type of tin, and then they can take that and match that with the known ancient sources of tin that could have been traded in several thousand years ago, and they can match that result with each source. And the most logical source, according to the authors, the most likely suppliers of the tin that came into Israel at about the time the Israelites entered the land, was from tin mines in Cornwall and Devon in Great Britain. And it's not, to a lot of Bible students, that's not particularly surprising, given a couple of reasons that we'll get to in a minute. But it's far more definitive now than what it has been recently. And it's quite interesting that the tin ingots from Crete and Turkey appear to have a completely different source to the ones that have arrived in Israel. So that's the map of the little dots are the sites that the tin was obtained from, or the tin samples were obtained from. The red splots are ancient sources of tin, ancient mines, and the yellow is just a stylized indication that this tin was coming to Britain, to Israel at least, from Britain, from ancient Britain. So the importance of it all is that once the Bronze Age hit ancient Israel, so ancient epochs tend to be described in terms of the metal that was available, and the harder those metals got, essentially made them high quality weapons in particular. So if you were fighting a copper-clad person with a bronze sword, your sword was much better than your bronze sword was much better than their copper shield, because it was so much harder, and it came through a process of alloying, so mixing two metals together. So Israel had a lot of copper, but no tin, and so they had to find it. And there's writers on the ancient world say that gold and silver could finance a war, but bronze was the thing that could win it. And tin once held a value and strategic importance similar to that of oil. So if we think of the conflicts around the world that we know of that have been fought over oil, it's a similar importance that was laid on tin. And this is, judging by how much effort went into finding it, the price of that tin must have been very high. Now, the interesting part several interesting parts of all of this, knowing the origin of where that tin came from proves that there was a very large and complicated and far-reaching trade network. And so, because there, as you can see from that map, there's almost no tin deposits in the local area. It had to be imported, and it became essentially an indispensable commodity that was worth scouring the world for and going to war over. Now, the reason that we read that chapter that we did to introduce tonight was for the purpose that we're about to talk about. The interesting part of the identification with Israelite tin, of Israelite tin with Cornwall, with Britain, is the implication for other biblical passages. So there's other things which are the places that you can put tin and Britain together to help draw a conclusion. So in Ezekiel 27, we read verse all the way through to verse 25, but just like to focus on verse 2 and verse 12 for now. And those verses are, "Now thou son of man," that's speaking to Ezekiel, "take up a lamentation for Tyrus." Tyrus is the word for Tyre, and Tyre was the capital city of the Phoenicians, who were the traders in the area. They were the people that knew how to run ships and run them a long way, and could send them particularly out beyond the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic if they needed to, and had the skills to do that. And verse 12 of Ezekiel 27, "Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kind of riches, with silver, iron, tin, and lead. They traded in thy fairs." And that's in the context, if we go back through that chapter, you'll see it's the context of listing the major commercial partners of Tyre, the people who traded with them, and the major commodities that they did. It's a huge list of Tyre's trading partners. And in the context of that, we get this country called Tarshish, whose commodities are silver, iron, tin, and lead. And so in order to locate where Tarshish was, because it appears in Ezekiel 38, and we won't go into that now, but suffice to say that it's a prophecy of the end time, and it becomes important to know who Tarshish is. The approach previously has been to find places where you could get those four commodities together, and that list of nations or list of places is very small. What this discovery does is it more or less definitively says that the tin that came from Tarshish was from Great Britain, and therefore Great Britain is one of those places that you can find silver, iron, tin, and lead all together, and tends to indicate or adds extra weight to the argument that Britain is Tarshish, and that has implications for that later prophecy, which can be discussed later on if you'd like.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Are all those points tin from Tarshish?
No, that's the location of the tin that was used in that study that I talked about. So some of those were, so like I said, the ones around Crete and Turkey actually had completely different sources.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So,
and was the ship that they found on Phoenicians?
correct. Yep. Ships. So second to last thing that I'd like to talk about, and I'll try and get through this reasonably quickly, is Herbert Caiafa. Almost guaranteed that's not how you pronounce that as well, but nonetheless. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a simpler name at the moment. What is it? It's an excavation of a fortified town or a fort in the Judean hills near the Valley of Elah. So my apologies, I intended to put a map in here somewhere and I didn't. for this and for Shiloh. So essentially, this is slightly to the southwest of Jerusalem. And the Valley of Elah is the location that the scripture describes as the place where the Philistines and the Israelites fought in the battle that David killed Goliath. So since this site was first unveiled in 2018, it has become one of the most important ongoing excavations in the world of biblical archaeology. And the reason for that is that in the opinions of the archaeological community, the historical existence of David and Solomon is somewhat accepted, but only somewhat. There's not really a lot of evidence for a powerful Israelite kingdom in Judah or centered on Jerusalem at that time. It has been helped in recent times by finds that refer to things like the House of David. And for some people, that's ended the argument. For other people, it's still a little bit dicey. So essentially, it's difficult to prove the existence of a kingdom like David and Solomon's from the current archaeological record, is the thought. And so this site has essentially become a litmus test of sorts for the existence of that kingdom. And that's an image of the site, so you can see sort of the scale of what we're talking about. So what has been found? Quite recently, several objects which appear to be representations of the temple in Jerusalem, which would indicate a link between Jerusalem and this fortified town. And those things appear to reflect the architecture of the temple as described in the scripture, including the presence of the two pillars at the front entry. Probably more notable than what has been found as what hasn't, and this is where we get back to things like animal bones. They have found none of the figurines of animals or people that are common at other sites, the small gods and that sort of thing that prevailed in the world at that time. They've found thousands of bones of sheep, goats, and cattle, but none of pigs. Zero. And the suggestion then is that what that tells us is that the residents followed a prohibition against idol worship and a dietary prohibition against eating pigs, which, if you're familiar with the law of the Israelites, will sound very familiar indeed, because that's precisely what two of the large features of the law of Moses for the Israelites are. So that's one aspect. It's the elements which point towards it being a city which was occupied by at least Israelites and probably people from Judah. And the fortified nature of the settlement. So you saw in that picture the large wall around the outside of it. The fortified nature is important because members of the minimalist school of Bible archaeology, that's people who dispute the link between archaeology and the scriptures, people who claim that there was no organized kingdom in Judah at the time of David, or at the time David was supposed to have existed, have based that conclusion in part on the absence of large fortified towns like this. So building cities like this requires centralized administration, is the thought. You're pouring a lot of money in, you're making a lot of people available to build walls and things like that may only be occasionally required. They're not things that are necessary to feed your family. So it requires a lot of resources and effort put into building these sorts of things. And so these types of cities tend to exist where you have a centralized administration, such as you'd find in an organized kingdom. And so the presence of this city, which can be linked to a kingdom centered at Jerusalem, adds weight to the argument that there was indeed a kingdom centered in Jerusalem at that time. But what was the town's name? The archaeologist, Yossi Garfinkel, I think is his name, found his answer when he discovered that the fortified city had not one, but two gates. And it's the only site that's been found in the kingdoms of Judah and Israel that have that. And I presume that means the only sort of small site like this. Now, two gates in the Hebrew is Sharaim, and we find a city of that name mentioned in the scripture. Interestingly, 1 Samuel 17 verse 52, it describes the Philistines fleeing back to Gath via the road from Sha'araim, which this city, located at the head of the Valley of Elah, on one side, the valley in the middle, and the cities of Gath at the other, would fit that description. And this, so therefore, this the city would seem to show that fortified cities linked with what was going on in Jerusalem did actually exist, and meaning that there could well have been a centralized kingdom like the one described in the Bible. Very briefly, other things that add weight to the idea of a central administration of a powerful kingdom in 10th century BC, copper mines at Timnah, and you can see the map, that dot, perhaps you can't see the writing, but that dot down the bottom near Elat. Is Timnah. There's a large copper mining complex down there. Previously, it was thought that it was a complex controlled by the Egyptians several hundred years later. What's been discovered is that its primary source or its primary point of production was the 10th century, around the time of David and Solomon. Now, what you can see from it being right out in the middle of the desert there is that it takes a massive amount of effort to supply a copper mine, or a copper smelting plant, sorry, down there. They've, in one of those other sites down there, they've dug through 20 feet, which is 6 meters, roughly, of slag, of waste. So it was a massive operation. There was a massive amount of copper produced out of it. And when you compare that with things like the amount of copper that Solomon collected for the temple, or the amount of bronze that Solomon collected for the temple, of which copper is a major component, you start to see how archaeologists are starting to make the link between these things. But nonetheless, you're right out in the middle of the desert, and it's a really resource-hungry industry. You have to have fires burning at about 1200 degrees Celsius, which requires charcoal. You've got to get water from 12 miles away because there's no water at the site. You've got to get food to everyone out there, and you have to get animal food to all the animals that have to haul the copper back from down there back to wherever it's going. So, and then of course you have a metal which is strategically important, and therefore you've got to defend the whole thing. So you can see how it all starts to become reliant, or it can be seen to be reliant on being able to organise that from the type of large organised kingdom that David and Solomon would have been part of. It's not definite that it was controlled by Israelites. It's basically definite that the people who actually did the mining there were Edomites, but the question arises as to who was in control of it. And that becomes an even more interesting question when we realise that basically all the major powers of the area, the Hittites, the Egyptians, and such like, the Assyrians, were all in decline at this point, to the point that none of those powers have any records about the world at that time. And that's another thing that creates a bit of confusion in terms of the kingdoms of David and Solomon. You get this historical dark age, essentially, where no one has written anything about it, because that they all had their own problems and they were all in decline at the time. Startlingly well-preserved animal dung indicates that the food, at least for the animals, was really high quality. So when they were digging it up, they found some donkey poo, which they suspected could have come from herders being there several decades earlier. It was so well preserved, and so it was a real shock when they sent it away for dating. It came back saying it was 10th century before Christ era donkey. But because it's so high quality, they can see exactly what's in it, and they can analyze where it came from, and they can tell that it's high quality food that's come from 160 kilometers north. Jerusalem was about twice that far, slightly less. So it's doesn't directly link it to Jerusalem, but it links it to the area that is much closer to to control by Jerusalem. So what we do have is evidence that that major production of mining out in the middle of the desert, which requires a lot of effort to control it and to manage it, was occurring at the time of the kingdoms of David and Solomon. And so there's evidence pointing to the fact that that area was at least possibly controlled by Jerusalem. There's other things that come out of the mines in the area that also link up with the scripture, but we can talk about those later on, because I'm pushing it a little for time. So I think we'll finish at that point with a few thoughts about what it all means. It can't be said that archaeology proves or disproves most things biblical. It will do that for some things. It will prove some things, but the proof or the disproof of most things biblical cannot be done with archaeology. It's too murky. It's an inexact science, and it's the source of a lot of controversy. And I've touched on a little bit of that. And like I say, if you choose to go and do your own reading, you will find that enough to make your head spin. And you sometimes, a couple of points, I got to the point where I didn't know what to think. And so it's important to remember that contrary opinions will almost always exist when we're looking at these things. However, what is fascinating is to see the Bible come to light in the way it does when we consider these things, when we think about the fact that we have a tiny piece of clay, which Hezekiah almost certainly pushed his ring into 2,000 years ago to make that imprint. And consideration of that hopefully helps to build upon the faith that we hold. So I'm grateful for you taking the time to hear this tonight, and hopefully it's given you something to think about, and welcome any conversation afterwards. Thank you.